The sea on a winter's night has a way of muting the world. Above the surface, the half-moon hung pale in the sky, spreading a thin trail of silver across the Pacific swells. Each crest rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed eternal, indifferent to the Great War raging across continents. There was no sound but the wind over the water, and even that came in whispers. But beneath that shimmering skin of the ocean, a predator was waiting. The submarine was USS Archerfish, a Balao-class boat of the United States Navy. She was 311 feet of welded steel, painted in dull gray. Her conning tower just a shadow against the moonlit sea. When she surfaced, her periscope and radar antenna barely breaking the horizon when she submerged. Inside her pressure hull, the air was close and heavy, tinged with oil, sweat, and machinery. Men moved quietly around valves, gauges, and plotting tables, their voices hushed, their concentration absolute. They had been at war for years now, and yet in this moment, something felt different. Something monumental was unfolding. At the center of it stood Commander Joseph F. Enright, a 33-year-old officer with dark eyes and a reputation that had been, until recently, uncertain. He had tasted failure before. On an earlier command, he had hesitated at crucial moments and returned from patrol without firing a single torpedo. To a submariner in wartime, such a patrol was more than disappointing, it was shameful. Enright had even requested to be relieved, feeling that his instincts had failed him. Tonight, in these black waters south of Honshu, he intended to redeem himself. Enright stood at the periscope, one hand resting lightly on the grip, the other fingering a rosary in his pocket. He was Catholic, and while not outwardly pious, he found comfort in that string of beads when responsibility weighed on him. And responsibility was heavy tonight. Somewhere to the north, beyond the headlands of Tokyo Bay, an enormous Japanese vessel was moving. The radar operator had called it out first, just a blip, 12 miles away, steady on a southwest course. The contact was large, unmistakably so, and Enright knew in his bones that this was no ordinary freighter. What Enright could not know yet was the scale of what lay before him. The ship he was stalking was Shinano, the pride of Japanese shipyards, and at 71,890 tons, fully loaded, she was the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. She had been completed in secrecy, commissioned only days earlier, and sent into the night with skeleton training and unfinished systems. She was supposed to be a symbol of strength, of defiance. Instead, she was steaming unknowingly toward a single submarine, commanded by a man who needed redemption as badly as the Japanese Navy needed a miracle. The moon slipped briefly behind a veil of clouds, darkening the horizon. In that moment, the men aboard Archerfish felt the ocean grow even quieter, as though holding its breath. Enright leaned into the eyepiece once more. The silhouette was faint, but there it loomed. He saw the escorts, darker smudges, cutting through the water around the main vessel. A destroyer turned sharply, racing toward them. And for an instant, it seemed the hunter had become the hunted. Then, inexplicably, the destroyer sheared off, wheeled back, and resumed station alongside its charge. The chance remained. Enright whispered to his officers, calm but firm. Stay with her. Let her zigzag. We will find where she straightens out. His words carried not just orders, but a promise to himself, to his men, to his career. He would not hesitate. This time, he would trust his instincts. He would strike. The clock ticked toward midnight. Somewhere ahead, the largest warship in history moved through the night, unaware that beneath the calm sea, a submarine and her determined captain had locked her in their sights. The stage was set. The game of patience, geometry, and fate had begun. On this November night, in 1944, two ships would meet in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built. The other was a standard submarine of no special distinction. When the sun rose, only one would remain. That is the nature of war at sea. Sudden, decisive, and final. The year was 1944, and the tide of the Second World War had turned with a force that was now undeniable. For Japan, the empire that had once stretched from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma, the war was no longer about expansion. It was about survival. The empire stood on the defensive, battered from the air, strangled at sea, and bleeding in its outer island fortresses. The Pacific was no longer a vast moat protecting the Japanese home islands. It had become a battlefield that shrank with each passing month. American forces had leapt from island to island in a relentless advance. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and then the Marianas. Each step brought U.S. forces closer to Japan's heart. With every landing, the Japanese military was forced to fight from a weaker position, stretched thin, with resources dwindling and morale sinking. By the summer of 1944, the Philippines campaign had begun. General Douglas MacArthur, true to his famous promise, had returned. His troops were battling their way through Leyte and beyond, while Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the great fleets of the U.S. Pacific Navy in a steady march toward Okinawa. The oceans themselves had become hostile to Japanese shipping. Once the Imperial Navy had dominated those waters, but now it was American submarines that ruled beneath the waves. These silent service boats were proving devastatingly effective. Submarines like Archerfish had cut Japan's merchant fleet to ribbons. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies were going down faster than they could be replaced. Cargo ships bringing food, weapons, and raw materials were easy prey for submarines armed with patience and torpedoes. By late 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant fleet, and the shortage was crippling. Factories went idle for lack of raw materials. Troops in the field went hungry. Aircraft sat grounded without fuel. The submarine blockade was bleeding Japan to death as surely as any battle on land. In response to this crisis, Japanese military planners grew desperate. They needed a weapon, a decisive advantage that could turn the tide, or at least slow the American advance long enough to negotiate a peace that preserved some semblance of the empire. The idea emerged from the wreckage of earlier dreams. Before the war, Japan had begun construction of 3 Yamato-class battleships, the largest and most powerful battleships ever conceived. Yamato herself was already in service. Musashi, the second, had been completed and fought at Leyte Gulf before being sunk by American aircraft. The third ship, originally named Hull No. 110, had been under construction at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal since May 1940. She was to be another super battleship, mounting 18.1-inch guns, capable of hurling shells weighing over 3,200 pounds more than 25 miles. But after the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan's strategic situation had changed fundamentally. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers had shown that the age of the battleship was over. Naval warfare now belonged to carrier aircraft. The decision was made to convert Hull 110 into an aircraft carrier. But not just any carrier. She would be the largest ever built, a floating fortress that combined carrier striking power with battleship armor. She would be unsinkable, they said, immune to torpedo attack, a symbol of Japanese engineering prowess and martial determination. They named her Shinano, after the longest river in Japan, a name meant to evoke permanence and strength. Her construction proceeded in great secrecy, behind massive canvas curtains. Workers labored around the clock, and security was so tight that even aerial reconnaissance by American aircraft failed to reveal what was being built. Shinano's statistics were staggering. 872 feet long, 119 feet wide, 71,890 tons, fully loaded. She could carry up to 47 aircraft. Though her design emphasized supporting other carriers rather than conducting strikes herself. Her flight deck was armored with 7.5 inches of steel, capable of withstanding bomb hits that would cripple American carriers. Her sides were protected by 16 inches of battleship armor, and she incorporated elaborate damage control systems, including 19 watertight compartments. But grand designs on paper do not always translate to reality at sea. And in the desperate autumn of 1944, with American forces closing in, Shinano would be rushed to completion long before she was truly ready. Commander Joseph Enright's path to redemption had been neither straight nor certain. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1933, a year when America was still mired in the Great Depression, and the Navy was shrinking rather than growing. His early career had been unremarkable but competent. The steady climb of a professional officer through destroyer and submarine assignments. When war came after Pearl Harbor, Enright found himself given command of USS Dace, a fleet submarine. It was the opportunity every submarine officer dreamed of. Command meant responsibility, independence, the chance to strike at the enemy and make a difference in the war. But Enright's first war patrol had ended in failure and shame. He had encountered a Japanese convoy, positioned Dace for attack, and then hesitated. The geometry seemed wrong. The escorts seemed too alert. Some instinct had warned him away, and he had broken off the attack. He returned to base, having fired no torpedoes, sunk no ships, accomplished nothing. In the submarine service, where aggressive action was the highest virtue, such caution was unforgivable. The aftermath was brutal. Enright was relieved of command. Dace went to another captain, who promptly took her out and sank several Japanese ships. The contrast was devastating. Enright requested shore duty, feeling he had lost whatever edge a submarine captain needed. But Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of submarines in the Pacific, saw something in Enright that others had missed. He saw not a coward, but a conscientious officer who had lost his nerve temporarily but might regain it given another chance. At Midway Naval Base, Lockwood sat down with Enright at a poker table. They played for hours, and Lockwood watched how Enright approached the game. He bluffed aggressively. He took calculated risks. He played to win, not to avoid losing. Finally, Lockwood asked him directly, "Joe, would you command a submarine the way you play cards?" Enright's answer was simple, yes. That answer earned him USS Archerfish. She was a standard Balao-class submarine. Nothing special. But she was seaworthy, and her crew was trained. Enright took command in March 1944 and spent months drilling his crew, running practice approaches, learning to trust his instincts again. Several patrols followed with modest success. A few ships sunk, confidence gradually building. By November 1944, Archerfish was on her 5th war patrol. The mission orders had been routine: patrol the waters south of Tokyo Bay, interdict enemy shipping, rescue downed American airmen if carrier strikes were launched. The submarine had been assigned to lifeguard duty on November 28th, waiting to pick up pilots from air raids that never materialized. Released from lifeguard duty that evening, Enright took Archerfish northwest, hoping to find targets approaching or leaving Tokyo Bay. The night was clear, the sea moderate, visibility good. At approximately 8:48 p.m. on November 28th, Archerfish's radar operator detected a contact bearing 0 degrees true, range 12 miles. The contact was large, too large to be a merchantman or even a cruiser. Enright ordered the submarine to surface and increase speed, using her diesel engines to close the range while staying beyond visual detection distance. The contact was moving southwest at approximately 18 knots, zigging and zagging in an irregular pattern. This evasive maneuvering was standard procedure for Japanese ships in waters where American submarines prowled. As Archerfish closed the range, additional radar contacts appeared, smaller and faster, moving in coordination with the main target. Destroyers, at least 3, possibly 4, screening the larger vessel. This was no convoy of merchantmen, but a high-value target, important enough to warrant multiple escorts. Enright's mind raced through possibilities. Could this be Yamato herself, venturing out from her anchorage? The super battleship was known to be in Japanese home waters, conserving fuel, waiting for the decisive battle that never seemed to come. Or was this something else? Intelligence reports had been vague about Japanese capital ship movements. What Enright did not know was that he had stumbled upon the maiden voyage of the largest aircraft carrier in the world. Shinano had departed Yokosuka Naval Arsenal that afternoon at 6:00 p.m., commanded by Captain Toshio Abe, a veteran officer with extensive battleship experience but no carrier experience. Her crew numbered 2,360 men, many of them barely trained, some still civilian workers finishing last-minute installations. Her destination was Kure Naval Arsenal, roughly 400 miles southwest. There, she would complete her fitting out, embark her air group, and conduct training before deploying to combat operations. The voyage was supposed to be routine, a simple transit along the coast, protected by darkness and destroyer escort. But the waters south of Honshu were prime hunting grounds for American submarines, and Shinano was about to discover just how vulnerable even the largest warship could be. Enright's first reaction, upon detecting the massive radar contact, was cautious excitement. This was the opportunity he had been seeking. A chance to strike a significant blow, to prove that his earlier failure had been an aberration rather than a defining characteristic. But caution tempered his excitement. He had failed once by hesitating. He could fail again by rushing. He called his officers to the conning tower. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bunting, the executive officer, arrived first, followed by Lieutenant David Bunting, no relation, who served as the approach officer. Lieutenant Frank Walker handled the torpedo data computer, a mechanical calculator that took bearing and range information and computed firing solutions. Enright explained the situation calmly. Large contact, heavily escorted, zigging. We will shadow on the surface, using radar to maintain contact. We will track the zigs, establish the base course, and position ourselves ahead for a submerged attack. Speed is essential, but stealth more so. If the escorts detect us, this ends badly. The crew responded with disciplined efficiency. They had practiced this scenario dozens of times during training. Radar operators plotted each bearing and range measurement. Plotters in the control room marked the target's movements on transparent paper, overlaying a chart. The torpedo data computer hummed and clicked, constantly updating the firing solution based on target course, speed, and position. But the target refused to cooperate. Shinano zigged every 6 to 10 minutes, turning 45 degrees or more from her base course, holding the new course for varying times, then zigging again. This evasive maneuvering was designed to foil submarine attacks by making it impossible to predict the target's position at any given future moment. And it was working. Every time Enright thought he had positioned Archerfish for an attack, Shinano would zig away, forcing a new approach. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Archerfish shadowed through the darkness, her diesels driving her at maximum sustainable speed, trying to get ahead of the target for a submerged attack. But the geometry refused to align. Shinano's base course was southwest toward Kure, but her zigs took her east, then west, then east again. The destroyer escorts maintained vigilant patrol, occasionally racing toward Archerfish's position as if they had detected something, then returning to formation. Enright's frustration grew, but he forced himself to remain calm. Patience, persistence, trust the process. His hands were steady on the periscope handles during brief looks. His voice remained even when giving orders. But inside, doubt whispered, what if this was Dace all over again? What if he lost this target through excessive caution or miscalculation? At 2:45 a.m. on November 29th, the situation changed. Shinano's zigzag pattern had gradually moved her westward from her base course. Enright made a decision. Instead of continuing to shadow from behind, trying to get ahead on the current base course, he would run parallel to Shinano's general direction of advance, positioning Archerfish several miles to port of where he estimated Shinano would eventually emerge from her zigzag pattern. It was a gamble. If Shinano continued her westward drift, Archerfish would be in perfect position. If Shinano turned back east, the submarine would be left behind. Enright made the call. All ahead, full. Make for position 6 miles ahead on estimated track. Archerfish surged forward, her diesels roaring, throwing spray as she crashed through the moderate seas. The crew could feel the difference. The change from cautious shadowing to aggressive positioning. This was commitment. No more waiting. Strike or accept failure. At 3 a.m., Enright ordered Archerfish to dive. They had reached what his calculations indicated was the optimal attack position. If Shinano continued on her base course toward Kure, she would pass within torpedo range in approximately 30 minutes. The submarine settled to periscope depth, 65 feet below the surface. The diesels fell silent. The electric motors took over, quiet and smooth. The only sounds were the gentle hum of ventilation fans and the breathing of 78 men waiting in the darkness. Enright raised the periscope for a quick look. Darkness. Sea. Nothing visible. He lowered the scope and waited. In the control room, men checked equipment, adjusted trim, whispered reports. The torpedo tubes were flooded and ready, their outer doors still closed to avoid creating noise that might alert the escorts. At 3:15 a.m., the sonar operator reported propeller sounds bearing 320 degrees, multiple contacts, heavy screws, and lighter destroyer screws. Range closing. Enright raised the periscope again. This time he saw them. Destroyer to the left, large silhouette behind it. Another destroyer to the right. Range approximately 2,000 yards and closing. The geometry was perfect. Shinano embodied contradictions that would prove fatal. She was built with battleship strength, but rushed to completion with carrier haste. Designed for invulnerability, but deployed with untrained crew. Intended as a symbol of Japanese power, but sent to sea with fundamental systems incomplete. The carrier's armor was magnificent. Her flight deck incorporated 7.5 inches of steel plating, making her the only carrier in the world that could withstand direct bomb hits without catastrophic damage. Her sides were protected by 16 inches of battleship armor, the same protection that made Yamato virtually immune to shell fire. Her underwater protection included multiple layers of steel and void spaces designed to absorb torpedo impacts. Yet this armor created the illusion of invulnerability that bred complacency. Captain Abe and his officers believed Shinano was unsinkable. The elaborate damage control systems, The watertight compartments, the pumping capacity, all suggested that the ship could survive hits that would sink lesser vessels. This confidence led to decisions that contradicted common sense. The most glaring contradiction was the crew's training, or lack thereof. Shinano commissioned on November 19, 1944, just 10 days before her maiden voyage. Her crew had conducted no sea trials, no damage control drills at sea, no training in actual ocean conditions. Many sailors had reported aboard only days earlier. Some were still learning their way around the massive ship. Others were civilian workers who had remained aboard to complete installations. This meant that when crisis came, the crew would have to respond to situations they had never practiced, using equipment they barely understood, following procedures they had never rehearsed. The contradiction between the ship's sophisticated design and the crew's rudimentary training would prove catastrophic. Another contradiction involved the ship's systems. Shinano's design included elaborate damage control features, pumps that could move thousands of tons of water per hour, watertight doors that could isolate damaged sections, fire suppression systems throughout the ship. But many of these systems were not yet functional. Some pumps had not been tested. Watertight doors were stuck open because compartments were still being worked on. Electrical systems were incomplete. The ship that departed Yokosuka was a magnificent hull with unfinished internals. She looked impressive, but critical systems that would mean life or death in battle were not ready. The rush to get her to Kure for completion meant she sailed in a vulnerable state that contradicted her reputation for invulnerability. The contradiction extended to her mission. Shinano was designed as a support carrier intended to supply, repair, and rearm aircraft from other carriers during extended operations. This was a rational response to the problem of keeping carrier aircraft operational during long campaigns far from bases. Shinano could carry spare aircraft, replacement parts, ammunition, and fuel. She could perform maintenance and repairs that other carriers could not. But this support role contradicted the psychological need for Shinano to be a frontline combatant. Japanese military culture valued offensive action, aggressive engagement with the enemy. A carrier whose primary mission was supporting other carriers seemed defensive, passive, unsatisfying. This contradiction between practical design and cultural expectations influenced how Shinano was perceived and employed. The zigzag pattern Shinano followed during her transit contradicted effective anti-submarine tactics. Zigzagging was supposed to make submarine attacks difficult by constantly changing course. But the pattern Shinano used was regular and predictable. Every 6 to 10 minutes, turn 45 degrees, hold briefly, turn back. Effective zigzag patterns required irregular timing, varied turn angles, and unpredictable sequences. Shinano's pattern was none of these. It provided the illusion of security while actually making the carrier easier to track. The contradiction between zigzag theory and zigzag practice would allow Archerfish to maintain contact throughout the long pursuit. The most profound contradiction was philosophical. Japan's strategic situation by late 1944 made the construction of superweapons increasingly irrelevant. The war was being lost not through lack of powerful individual ships, but through systematic destruction of merchant shipping, loss of trained personnel, and overwhelming American industrial production. Building one enormous carrier would not change these fundamentals. Yet Japanese planners continued to believe in the decisive weapon, the super battleship or supercarrier that would turn the tide through sheer power. This belief contradicted the reality that wars are won by systems, by the side that can build, train, and sustain forces over time. Shinano represented the ultimate expression of this flawed philosophy, a magnificent vessel whose very existence contradicted strategic necessity. These contradictions, design versus readiness, armor versus training, theory versus practice, would converge on the night of November 29th, when Archerfish's torpedoes struck home. At 3:17 a.m. on November 29th, 1944, Commander Enright gave the order, "Fire 1." The submarine shuddered slightly as the first Mark 14 torpedo left its tube, propelled by compressed air. Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. In quick succession, 6 torpedoes left Archerfish's forward tubes, their electric motors driving them at 46 knots toward Shinano's massive hull. The firing solution had been perfect. Range 1,800 yards. Angle on the bow, 20 degrees starboard. Target speed, 18 knots. The torpedoes were set to run at 10 feet depth, shallow enough to strike below the waterline, but above the anti-torpedo bulge that might absorb the impact. Enright watched through the periscope, counting seconds. The torpedoes would take approximately 90 seconds to reach their target. Time seemed to stretch. Then, at 3:19 a.m., the first explosion. Enright saw the flash, the column of water rising alongside Shinano's hull. 20 seconds later, another explosion. Then a third, a fourth. 4 hits out of 6 torpedoes. The Mark 14 torpedoes, plagued by problems early in the war, had finally been perfected. These ran true, their magnetic exploders functioning as designed, detonating when they sensed the magnetic field of a large steel hull. Each torpedo carried 670 pounds of torpex, an explosive compound more powerful than TNT. 4 hits meant nearly 2,700 pounds of explosive detonating against Shinano's hull. The shock wave from the first explosion rippled through the carrier. Watertight doors that should have been closed were open. Compartments that should have been sealed were accessible. Water began flooding into spaces that were supposed to remain dry. The second torpedo struck further forward, blowing a hole approximately 30 feet wide below the waterline. The third and fourth hits opened additional breaches. Within minutes, thousands of tons of seawater were pouring into Shinano's hull. The elaborate damage control systems, incomplete and untested, failed to respond effectively. Captain Abe's initial reaction was confidence. Shinano was designed to survive torpedo hits. The ship had taken 4, perhaps 5 hits, but she was still afloat, still making way, still steaming toward Kure. He ordered the damage control teams to assess the flooding and begin countermeasures. He increased speed to 20 knots, believing that maintaining way would help keep the bow up and reduce flooding. But this decision, born from confidence in his ship's unsinkability, was exactly wrong. Increasing speed forced more water through the torpedo holes. The water pressure at 20 knots was far greater than at lower speeds. What might have been manageable flooding at 10 knots became catastrophic flooding at 20 knots. Water spread through compartments, overwhelming pumps, shorting electrical systems, flooding machinery spaces. The damage control investigation revealed the extent of the disaster. The first torpedo had struck between frames 130 and 150, flooding the starboard-outboard engine room. The second hit between frames 139 and 136, flooding additional machinery spaces. The third and fourth hits opened the hull further aft, allowing water to spread through interconnected compartments. The watertight doors that should have isolated these flooded spaces were open. Civilian workers had propped them open to move equipment. Some doors could not be closed because the mechanisms were jammed or not yet installed. As water spread, it encountered no barriers. Compartments that should have remained dry began flooding. The ship's list increased. First 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. By 4:30 a.m., 90 minutes after the torpedo hits, Shinano's situation was desperate. She had taken on thousands of tons of water. Her list had increased to 20 degrees. Power was failing in sections of the ship. Communication between damage control parties was breaking down. Yet Captain Abe still believed the ship could be saved. The investigation into why Shinano sank so quickly revealed multiple failures: the incomplete damage control systems, the untrained crew who did not know how to respond effectively, the open watertight doors that allowed flooding to spread, Captain Abe's decision to maintain high speed. But the fundamental failure was simpler and more profound. Shinano had been rushed to sea before she was ready. Her systems were incomplete. Her crew was untrained. Her voyage was premature. The consequence of these decisions was now manifesting in rising water, tilting decks, and spreading panic. The investigation that should have occurred before the ship sailed, the careful testing of systems, the thorough training of crew, had been skipped in the rush to get this symbol of Japanese power to sea. The consequence would be measured in lives lost, in a great ship destroyed, in resources wasted, and in the bitter realization that invulnerability is an illusion. No ship, regardless of size or armor, can survive when fundamental systems fail, and crews cannot respond effectively. Shinano, the largest carrier ever built, was dying 90 minutes after being torpedoed because the contradiction between design and readiness could not be overcome by confidence or courage alone. Two fundamentally opposed philosophies of naval warfare came into stark conflict on the night Archerfish torpedoed Shinano. These theories, one Japanese and one American, had been developing throughout the Pacific War, shaped by experience, culture, and industrial capacity. The outcome of their collision would reveal which approach to modern naval warfare was superior. Japanese naval theory had long emphasized the concept of the decisive battle. This philosophy traced back to Admiral Togo's victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, where Japan had destroyed an enemy fleet in a single, decisive engagement. The theory held that wars at sea were won by concentrating powerful ships, seeking battle at favorable terms, and achieving annihilating victory through superior ships and superior spirit. This theory led directly to the construction of superweapons. The Yamato-class battleships, with their 18.1-inch guns, were intended to be the decisive weapons that would destroy any American fleet that dared to challenge Japan. When carriers proved more important than battleships, the theory adapted. Shinano would be the decisive carrier, unsinkable and unstoppable, capable of supporting operations that would turn the tide of war. But this decisive weapon philosophy contained a fatal flaw. It assumed that individual weapons, however powerful, could overcome systemic disadvantages. It assumed that one supercarrier could compensate for the loss of trained pilots, the destruction of the merchant fleet, and the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States. The theory worked in games and staff exercises. It failed in the reality of total war. American naval theory had evolved differently. The United States embraced industrial warfare, emphasizing numbers over individual capability. Rather than building a few super weapons, America built hundreds of good weapons. Rather than seeking the decisive battle, America conducted sustained attrition warfare, gradually wearing down enemy forces until they could no longer resist. This theory manifested in submarine warfare doctrine. American submarines were not superweapons. They were numerous, reliable, and employed in systematic campaigns that strangled Japanese logistics. The submarines sank merchant ships carrying oil, food, and raw materials. They sank tankers, transports, and cargo vessels. They created a blockade that slowly choked Japan's industrial capacity and military effectiveness. American doctrine emphasized aggressive action, independent operation, and adaptive tactics. Submarine commanders were given broad authority to conduct operations as they saw fit. If a planned patrol area proved unproductive, commanders could relocate. If an opportunity appeared outside their assigned area, they could pursue it. This flexibility allowed submarines to exploit circumstances that rigid doctrine would have missed. Japanese anti-submarine theory, by contrast, emphasized defensive measures and rigid escort patterns. Ships zigzagged according to set patterns. Destroyers maintained fixed positions relative to the ships they protected. Doctrine prescribed responses to submarine threats. But this rigidity made Japanese forces predictable. Once American submariners learned the patterns, they could position themselves to exploit them. The theory of submarine employment also differed fundamentally. Japan used submarines primarily for military operations, attacking warships and supporting fleet actions. This meant Japanese submarines spent time searching for naval targets that were heavily defended and difficult to sink. American submarines, by contrast, focused on merchant shipping. Tankers and cargo ships were easier targets than warships, yet sinking them had greater strategic impact. The contrast in damage control theory was equally significant. American naval architecture and training emphasized survivability. Ships were designed with redundant systems, effective compartmentation, and sophisticated damage control capabilities. More importantly, crews trained constantly in damage control. Every sailor knew his battle station and his damage control station. They practiced fighting fires, controlling floods, maintaining stability under damage. Japanese damage control theory emphasized armor and design features rather than training and practice. Ships like Shinano were designed to be unsinkable through physical protection, but when those designs proved inadequate or when systems were incomplete, the lack of trained damage control parties meant ships could not effectively respond to damage. Theory said Shinano was unsinkable. Reality proved that no ship is unsinkable when its crew cannot control damage effectively. The theory of crew training represented another fundamental difference. American training programs had become industrial enterprises by 1944. Thousands of sailors passed through training schools that taught standardized skills using proven methods. Crews practiced together before deploying. Ships conducted extensive shakedown cruises to identify problems and train personnel. Japanese training theory emphasized spirit and determination over systematic preparation. Individual courage and devotion to emperor could overcome material disadvantages. Or so the theory held. But courage could not compensate for not knowing how to operate equipment, for never having practiced emergency procedures, for being assigned to a ship only days before it sailed on a combat deployment. The ultimate theoretical question was whether wars were won by decisive weapons or by systems. Shinano represented the decisive weapon theory taken to its logical extreme. She was the largest, most heavily armored, most sophisticated carrier ever built, yet she sank on her maiden voyage, destroyed by a standard American submarine that represented nothing special except competent operation of proven systems. The answer to the theoretical question could not have been clearer. The deeper mystery of Shinano's sinking centers on a question that haunted survivors and historians alike. How could the largest, most heavily armored carrier in the world sink from just 4 torpedo hits when other carriers had survived similar or greater damage? The answer reveals the complex interplay of design, training, leadership, and circumstance that determines whether ships survive battle damage or succumb to it. The turning point came not at 3:17 a.m. when Archerfish's torpedoes struck, but in the hours that followed when decisions made under stress determined whether Shinano would survive or die. Captain Abe faced a series of choices, and his decisions, made with the information he had and the confidence he felt in his ship's invulnerability, sealed Shinano's fate. The first critical decision was maintaining high speed after the torpedo hits. Abe believed that keeping Shinano moving toward Kure at 20 knots would allow the ship to reach port where proper repairs could be made. He trusted his ship's design, the armor, the compartmentation, the pumping capacity. He believed that maintaining way was more important than slowing to assess damage. But this decision transformed manageable flooding into catastrophic flooding. At 20 knots, water pressure forced thousands of additional tons of seawater through the torpedo holes every minute. The flooding spread faster than pumps could handle, faster than damage control parties could respond. Had Abe slowed to 5 or 10 knots, the flooding might have been contained. At 20 knots, it was unstoppable. The second critical decision was refusing to beach the ship. As Shinano's list increased and flooding continued, it became apparent that the carrier might not make it to Kure. Coastline was visible to the north. Several officers suggested running Shinano aground, deliberately beaching her in shallow water where she could not sink completely and where salvage efforts could eventually refloat her. But Abe refused. Beaching the largest carrier in the world on her maiden voyage would be an admission of failure and defeat that he could not accept. Japanese naval tradition emphasized fighting to the end, never surrendering, never giving up the ship while any hope remained. Abe believed that Shinano could still be saved. He continued steaming for Kure. This decision was the true turning point. Had Shinano been beached, hundreds of lives would have been saved. The ship might have been salvaged, or at least her destruction would have occurred in controlled circumstances. But pride and cultural expectations prevented this rational course of action. Abe chose to continue fighting for his ship rather than accepting the inevitable and saving his crew. The mystery deepens when examining why Shinano's damage control efforts failed so completely. The ship had been designed with elaborate systems for controlling flooding. Pumps capable of moving enormous volumes of water. Watertight compartments that could be isolated. Damage control parties equipped with tools and training. Yet all of these measures proved inadequate. Investigation after the war revealed multiple factors. Many watertight doors were propped open and could not be quickly closed. Some doors had jammed mechanisms or had not been installed yet. The pumping system, designed to work as an integrated network, failed when electrical power was lost in flooded sections. Damage control parties, many consisting of inexperienced sailors who had never practiced their assignments, could not respond effectively to rapidly evolving conditions. But the deepest mystery involved leadership and training. American carriers like Yorktown and Enterprise had survived multiple torpedo hits because their crews responded effectively. Damage control parties knew their assignments, had practiced their procedures, could adapt to unexpected circumstances. Shinano's crew had none of this preparation. They were thrust into crisis with inadequate training and no experience. The turning point occurred around 6 a.m., approximately 3 hours after the torpedo hits, when it became clear that Shinano could not be saved. Water had flooded so many compartments that the ship's list had increased to 30 degrees. Power was failing throughout the ship. Communications had broken down. Officers could not reach damage control parties. Sailors could not reach their abandoned ship stations. Abe finally gave the order to abandon ship at 7:30 a.m. But by then, many escape routes were blocked by flooding or the extreme list. Sailors attempting to reach the main deck found passageways flooded, ladders too steep to climb, hatches jammed shut. Some compartments became death traps as water rose, and men could not escape. At 8:30 a.m. on November 29, 1944, Approximately 5 hours after being torpedoed, Shinano capsized and sank. She rolled to starboard, her massive flight deck tilting until it was vertical, then continuing until the ship was completely inverted. For a moment, she floated upside down, her red-painted bottom exposed. Then, she slipped beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,400 men who could not escape or who chose to remain with their ship. Captain Abe stood on the bridge until the end, having ordered his officers and staff to abandon ship but choosing to go down with his command. It was the expected behavior, the honorable choice for a captain whose ship was lost. But it was also a final admission that all the decisions, all the confidence in invulnerability, all the belief in decisive weapons had been wrong. The turning point had been not any single decision, but the accumulated effect of decisions made before Shinano ever sailed. The decision to rush completion. The decision to sail with untrained crew. The decision to believe that design could overcome lack of preparation. These decisions, made by planners and admirals far from the scene, determined Shinano's fate as surely as Abe's decisions during the crisis itself. The implications of Shinano's sinking rippled through Japanese naval command like shockwaves from a depth charge. The loss of the world's largest carrier on her maiden voyage, destroyed by a single American submarine, represented more than a tactical defeat. It was a strategic disaster that revealed the fundamental weaknesses in Japan's approach to naval warfare and accelerated the psychological collapse that was already underway. The immediate tactical implication was the loss of a major asset. Shinano represented thousands of tons of steel, millions of man-hours of labor, and resources that Japan could not afford to waste. Her construction had diverted materials from other projects, consumed industrial capacity desperately needed elsewhere, and required skilled workers who might have been employed building smaller ships that could have entered service earlier. The strategic implication was more profound. Shinano was intended to be a symbol of Japanese technological prowess and military strength. Her existence was supposed to demonstrate that Japan could still build superweapons to match or exceed anything America produced. Her loss demonstrated instead that size and armor could not overcome fundamental problems with training, readiness, and operational competence. The psychological implications devastated Japanese naval morale. If the mightiest carrier ever built could be destroyed on her first voyage, what hope was there? Sailors who had believed in their navy's technological superiority now faced the reality that American submarines could strike anywhere, destroy anything. Japanese naval invincibility, already badly damaged by defeats at Midway and Leyte Gulf, shattered completely. The implications for American submarine doctrine were equally significant, but far more positive. Shinano's sinking validated everything the submarine force had been advocating. Submarines could operate independently deep in enemy waters. They could find and attack even the most heavily defended targets. They could strike decisive blows with limited resources. The age of the submarine as a strategic weapon had arrived, and Shinano's destruction proved it definitively. For Commander Enright, the implications were intensely personal. He had found redemption. His earlier failure aboard Dace was forgiven, forgotten, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his success with Archerfish. He had sunk the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. That achievement would define his career, his reputation, his legacy. The Navy Cross he received was validation that he had overcome his demons and emerged as one of the submarine force's most successful commanders. The technological implications extended to submarine warfare tactics and weapons. The Mark 14 torpedo, which had been plagued by problems early in the war, had finally been perfected. The magnetic exploder worked as designed. The depth control kept torpedoes running at the correct depth. 4 hits out of 6 shots demonstrated that American torpedoes had become reliable, deadly weapons. This reliability allowed submarine commanders to attack with confidence rather than wondering if their torpedoes would function. The implications for naval construction doctrine were equally important. Shinano's loss demonstrated that rushing ships to completion before they were ready was worse than delaying their deployment. An incomplete ship with an untrained crew was not merely less effective than a complete ship with a trained crew. It was actively dangerous, wasting resources and lives without contributing to combat effectiveness. The doctrine of building superweapons also faced devastating critique. While Japan built one enormous carrier that sank on its first voyage, America was building Essex-class carriers by the dozen. These smaller carriers, displacing less than half what Shinano displaced, were entering service fully ready, with trained crews and complete systems. They were fighting effectively throughout the Pacific. Numbers and readiness trumped size and armor. The implications for damage control training became apparent. American carriers that suffered torpedo or bomb hits frequently survived because their crews could control flooding, fight fires, and maintain stability under damage. Shinano's crew, despite having more sophisticated damage control systems on paper, could not respond effectively because they lacked training and experience. The implication was clear. Training mattered more than equipment. The strategic implications extended to the broader conduct of the Pacific War. Japan's strategy of seeking decisive engagements where superior weapons would destroy enemy forces had failed repeatedly. Midway, Philippine Sea, later Gulf, and now Shinano, all demonstrated that American industrial capacity, training programs, and operational doctrine were superior to Japanese hopes for technological miracles. The implications for Japan's ability to continue the war were dire. With Shinano sunk, the carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor was effectively extinct. Japan had no large carriers in service and no realistic prospect of building new ones. American carriers now ruled the Pacific without serious challenge. This meant American air power could support invasions, strike Japanese bases, and bomb the home islands with increasing impunity. The final implication was perhaps most sobering. Shinano's sinking demonstrated that, in modern warfare, victory goes to the side with better systems, not to the side with better individual weapons. America's system for building ships, training crews, developing doctrine, and conducting operations proved superior to Japan's system in every respect. Individual courage and determination could not overcome systematic advantages in training, resources, and operational competence. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the final cost in lives and suffering remained to be determined. The human dimension of Shinano's sinking carries a weight that statistics and tactical analyses cannot capture. Over 1,400 men died when the great carrier capsized and sank. Each death was an individual tragedy. Each man had a name, a family, a life that ended in the cold waters off Cape Omazaki. Some died quickly, trapped in compartments that flooded within minutes. Others died slowly, struggling in oil-covered water, succumbing to hypothermia or drowning from exhaustion. The survivors who made it off Shinano described scenes of chaos and courage. Young sailors helped comrades reach escape routes. Officers organized evacuation efforts even as the ship tilted beneath them. Some men gave up their life jackets to those who had none. Others pushed friends toward ladders and hatches before being trapped themselves. In the final moments, as Shinano rolled to starboard, men slid across tilting decks, grabbing for anything that might slow their fall into the sea. Captain Abe's final moments embodied the Japanese naval tradition of going down with one's ship. He stood on the bridge, watching his crew abandon ship, refusing to save himself while men under his command were dying. When the bridge began to submerge, Abe remained at his post. Witnesses reported that he stood at attention, hands at his sides as water rose around him. He made no attempt to swim free when the ship capsized. His body was never recovered. The destroyer escorts managed to rescue approximately 1,100 survivors from the water. They picked up men covered in oil, shivering from cold, some wounded, all exhausted. The rescued sailors were interrogated about what happened, but many were too traumatized to speak coherently. They had watched the mightiest carrier in the world sink beneath them. They had lost friends and comrades. Many suffered survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many others had died. For the families of those who died, the loss was communicated through official notifications that provided few details. The sinking was classified as a military secret. Families were told their sons, husbands, or fathers had died in service to the emperor, but not how or where. Only after the war ended did the full story begin to emerge, and by then, the pain of loss had been compounded by years of uncertainty. Aboard Archerfish, the human experience was different, but no less profound. Enright and his crew had achieved an unprecedented success, but they did not celebrate. They had sent over 1,400 enemy sailors to their deaths. The knowledge sat heavily on some crew members. Others rationalized it as the necessity of war, but none could entirely escape the human cost of what they had accomplished. Enright himself carried mixed emotions: relief at having redeemed himself after his earlier failure, pride in his crew's performance, satisfaction at striking such a significant blow against the enemy, but also a sobering awareness of the lives lost. He was Catholic and took no pleasure in death, even enemy death. He had done his duty, sunk a major enemy warship, helped win the war, but 1,400 men had paid for that victory with their lives. The contrast between the two crews illuminated different aspects of war's human dimension. Archerfish's crew was experienced, well-trained, confident in their equipment and their commander. They had prepared for this moment through months of drilling and previous patrols. When the attack came, they executed their assignments with professional competence, then escaped without casualties. Their war continued. Shinano's crew had no such preparation. Many were barely trained. Some were still learning their assignments when the torpedoes hit. They faced crisis without preparation, responded to chaos without practice, died without having had the chance to prove themselves in combat. Their war ended before it truly began. The human stories from Shinano's sinking include acts of remarkable courage. Engineers who remained at their posts, trying to keep pumps running even as water rose around them. Damage control parties who fought to close watertight doors, knowing they might be trapped on the wrong side. Officers who organized evacuation efforts rather than saving themselves. These stories, pieced together from survivor accounts, reveal the best of human nature under the worst circumstances. But there were also stories of panic and failure, men who abandoned their posts and fled to the upper decks, officers who lost control of their sections and could not organize effective responses, damage control efforts that collapsed into confusion as trained leaders were killed or trapped, and their replacements did not know what to do. These failures were not moral failings, but the inevitable result of inadequate training and impossible circumstances. The humanity of both sides deserves recognition. American submariners and Japanese carrier sailors were all young men serving their countries, following orders, trying to survive. War made them enemies. Both sides fought with courage. Both sides suffered losses. The human dimension transcends nationality to reveal the universal experience of warriors throughout history. Fear and courage duty and doubt, victory and loss, survival and death. The revelation about Shinano's sinking emerged gradually over years of investigation, analysis, and reflection. What initially seemed like a simple story of a submarine sinking a carrier revealed itself to be a complex case study in how wars are won or lost through the interaction of technology, training, leadership, and circumstance. The first revelation concerned the nature of vulnerability. Shinano was designed to be invulnerable to torpedo attack. Her armor, her compartmentation, her damage control systems all suggested that she could survive multiple hits. Yet she sank from 4 torpedo hits that other carriers might have survived. The revelation was that armor and design features cannot guarantee survival when crews cannot operate systems effectively and when fundamental preparations are incomplete. The second revelation involved the relationship between size and effectiveness. Shinano was the largest carrier ever built, intended to be the most powerful, but size without readiness is vulnerability rather than strength. A smaller carrier that is fully ready for combat is more valuable than a larger carrier that is incomplete and unprepared. Japan's obsession with building the biggest ship blinded planners to the reality that smaller numbers of ready ships would have served better than one giant, incomplete vessel. The third revelation concerned training and competence. Shinano's crew included many skilled and dedicated sailors, but they had not trained together, had not practiced damage control at sea, had not developed the teamwork and automatic responses that make crews effective. Archerfish's crew, by contrast, had trained together for months, practiced their attack procedures dozens of times, developed the trust and coordination that allows complex operations to succeed under stress. The revelation was that training matters more than any other single factor in determining combat effectiveness. Superior weapons cannot compensate for inadequate training. More armor cannot replace skilled damage control. Bigger ships cannot overcome poorly trained crews. The human element, properly developed through systematic training, determines whether advanced technology succeeds or fails. The fourth revelation involved leadership and decision-making under pressure. Captain Abe faced impossible choices with inadequate information and cultural expectations that limited his options. His decision to maintain speed, his refusal to beach the ship, his adherence to traditions that valued fighting over surviving, all contributed to Shinano's loss. But these were not failures of character. They were failures of doctrine, training, and cultural context. The revelation was that good leaders can make bad decisions when operating within flawed systems. Abe was an experienced officer, but his experience was in battleships, not carriers. He had received no training in carrier damage control. He had not practiced responding to torpedo damage on a carrier. He was commanding a ship he barely knew with a crew he had not trained. Under these circumstances, even good decisions were unlikely to save the ship. The fifth revelation concerned the nature of modern naval warfare. Shinano represented the old thinking that wars were won by decisive weapons, operated by determined warriors. Archerfish represented the new reality that wars were won by systems. Industrial production, systematic training, operational flexibility, and sustained operations that gradually wore down enemy capabilities. Japan built one magnificent carrier. America built dozens of good submarines. Japan sought decisive battle. America conducted war of attrition. Japan emphasized honor and tradition. America emphasized effectiveness and results. The revelation was that in total war between industrial nations, systematic advantages trump individual superiority. Wars are won by the side with better systems, not by the side with better individual weapons. The sixth revelation involved the role of intelligence and technology. Archerfish found Shinano through radar, a technology that Japanese ships lacked or used ineffectively. American submarines operated with excellent intelligence about Japanese movements, while Japanese commanders often operated blind. American torpedoes, after years of problems, finally worked reliably. Japanese damage control systems, sophisticated in theory, failed in practice because they were incomplete. The revelation was that technological advantage matters, but only when integrated into effective operational systems. Having advanced technology is meaningless if it is not used effectively, maintained properly, or integrated into doctrine that exploits its capabilities. The seventh revelation was strategic. Shinano's construction represented a massive investment of resources that Japan could not afford. The steel, labor, and industrial capacity devoted to building one giant carrier might have built several smaller ships that could have entered service earlier and contributed more to Japan's war effort. The decision to build Shinano reflected flawed strategic thinking that emphasized symbols over substance. The final revelation was philosophical. Shinano's story illustrates the danger of believing one's own mythology. Japanese planners believed that superior spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantages. They believed that one perfect weapon could change the war's trajectory. They believed that tradition and honor mattered more than systematic preparation. These beliefs, deeply embedded in military culture, led to decisions that wasted resources and lives without achieving strategic objectives. The revelation was that in modern warfare, reality defeats mythology. No amount of determination can overcome systematic disadvantages in training, resources, and doctrine. Wars are not won by believing strongly enough in victory. They are won by building effective systems, training competent personnel, and conducting operations that exploit advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. Shinano's sinking demonstrated this truth with devastating clarity. Shinano rests today in 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omazaki, approximately 20 miles from where she sank on November 29, 1944. She lies inverted, her flight deck buried in sediment, her once mighty hull slowly collapsing under the relentless pressure of the deep. She is a tomb for the 1,400 men who died with her, and a monument to the age when nations believed that bigger meant better, that one perfect weapon could change everything. The wreck was discovered in 2019 by deep-sea explorers using advanced sonar and submersible technology. The images they brought back showed a ship remarkably intact despite decades underwater. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had resisted the pressure that would have crushed lesser vessels. But she lies upside down, her intended glory forever buried in the seafloor, a monument to ambition that exceeded capability. Commander Joseph Enright went on to a successful naval career, retiring as a rear admiral in 1963. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking, maintaining the quiet professionalism of the submarine service. When asked about that November night, he would say simply that they had done their duty, that the torpedoes worked, that they were lucky. But those who knew him understood that it meant everything. The vindication of his courage, the proof that he belonged in command, the second chance that he had seized. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for decades. They would gather, these aging men who had once been young sailors, and remember their moment of glory. They told stories of the long chase, the tension of the approach, the thunder of torpedoes hitting home. But they also remembered Shinano's crew, fellow sailors who had died doing their duty. War had made them enemies. Time made them all simply men who had served at sea. The story of Shinano and Archerfish became legend in naval circles. Authors wrote books. Historians analyzed the engagement. veterans shared their memories, each telling added details, corrected errors, built the narrative that we know today. The legend grew until it sometimes obscured the human reality of what happened on that November night. For America, the sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that 80 men in a submarine could defeat thousands in a carrier, that patience and skill could overcome size and armor. It was David and Goliath, written in steel and torpedoes, proof that in war, the smallest unit could achieve strategic victory. The submarine force, so often overshadowed by carriers and battleships, had proven its strategic value beyond any doubt. For Japan, Shinano became a symbol of the war's last phase. Grand gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only added to the suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing toward disaster rather than accepting defeat. The loss contributed to the psychological collapse that was already underway. The growing realization that Japan could not win, and that continuing to fight only prolonged suffering. The lessons of Shinano remain relevant in an age when nations again compete to build the largest, most powerful warships. Technology advances, but the human factors that doomed her persist. Ships are still built in haste. Crews still sail with insufficient training. Leaders still believe that one supreme weapon can change everything. The ghost of Shinano warns against such hubris. The final lesson may be the most universal: that in war, as in life, the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Sometimes patience defeats power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Sometimes a single night's action can echo through history, teaching generations yet unborn about courage, folly, and the thin margin between victory and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built. The other was a standard submarine, of no special distinction. When the sun rose, only one remained. That is the nature of war at sea: sudden, decisive, and final. The ocean shows no favoritism to size or strength. It swallows all equally, keeping its secrets in the dark depths. Shinano's sinking proved that size without readiness is vulnerability, that armor without training is false security, that wars are won by systems, not symbols, that human factors, competence, preparation, and leadership matter more than tonnage or armor thickness. These lessons, learned at the cost of 1,400 lives, remain as relevant today as they were 80 years ago. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine rests in darkness, a giant felled by a predator she never truly saw. Her story endures not as a celebration of destruction, but as a cautionary tale about hubris, unpreparedness, and the unforgiving nature of war at sea. May those who study naval warfare remember Shinano and the men who died with her, and may the lessons of that November night prevent future tragedies born from pride exceeding preparation.